the invasion of Ukraine by Putin has very little to do with Ukraine. It doesn't have much to do with NATO. It has to do with Putin's desperate desire to hold on to power. He's been a dictator for 22 years. The life standard of living hasn't increased; it's just gone down for the Russian people. He's stolen an enormous amount of money, and people are starting to get tired of him. And he's watched what happened in Belarus with a similar dictator, Lukashenko. How the people rose up 18 months ago, and it was only with his intervention that he kept Lukashenko in power. He saw what happened to the dictator Nazarbayev in Kazakhstan, who basically got thrown out, earlier this year. And he saw the writing on the wall for himself, and he realized that if he just sat back and waited, something terrible would happen to him. And he understands full well that if he is deposed, he would have to face justice for his crimes, go to jail, lose his money, and probably die. And for pure physical and political survival, he did what every dictator does in a situation like that, which is he started a war. And the problem with Vladimir Putin is that his psychology is not one where he can ever show weakness, defeat. He has no reverse gear. And so this thing is just going to keep on going on and on until we contain him somehow.
Let me ask you this question. I was speaking with Alex Goldfarb just yesterday, and he said Putin is finished. And either Putin finishes himself, one of his oligarch friends does it, or some type of other action. And you indicated he might go to jail or something like that. Do you agree with that, Putin being finished?
Well, that's a very optimistic scenario. I wish that were the case. I mean, there is that's one. That's a I would say a small probability event. I think that the where we are right now, he could stay in. He's not that old. He's intending to stay in power for the rest of his natural life. He's a dictator. Everyone's scared of him. He's clamping down in Russia. There's a scenario on the other side. Let me paint you the worst case scenario for us in the West, is that he eventually, in a very ugly way, like he did in Syria or in Chechnya, he finishes off Ukraine with just unbelievable civilian casualties. And then he challenges us on the border of Estonia. And we have to then decide whether NATO is for real, whether we would actually enforce Article 5 of NATO, whether we're ready to go to war with Russia. And he might accompany that with a threat of nuclear war. That's the kind of guy he is. And then we have to decide, do we want to go to nuclear war with Vladimir Putin over Estonia? And I can imagine that there'll be a large part of the political discussion to say, well, wait a second, we don't want that. And I can imagine a scenario where we say, okay, we're going to draw the boundaries right here and allow him to have all the Warsaw Pact countries back. I mean, and then he's sitting there as a brutal dictator over a large empire. That's a very negative scenario, but that's kind of what he has in mind. And so, and we shouldn't just be thinking that he's all this is all going to end well for us. I mean, there's a lot of nastiness in between.
Okay, so instead of us just everybody kind of talking about that, then what do we do about it to stop it? I mean, a lot of people are talking about this scenario and that scenario. People are dying in Ukraine. What needs to be done and what can be done now to make sure none of that happens?
Well, so I think you need to start with the worst case scenario and say, what do we have? What needs to be done now to stop it? And the first line of defense for the worst case scenario, which is him effectively taking over half the world, is for us to do everything possible to assist the people, the brave Ukrainians who are holding him off. And they are the buffer between us and Vladimir Putin. And for us to be sort of thinking that this is their problem and not ours, that's just not correct. He's everybody's problem. And they're doing the fighting right now. And we should do everything possible that they're requesting to stop this atrocity. And that starts with supplying weapons, which we've been doing. We need to do it more. We need to supply medical help. We need to supply refugee help. We need to ratchet up the financial sanctions to a level that would have been unimaginable. And that means not just cutting off 70% of Russian banks from SWIFT, but 100%. We should sanction 50 or maybe 100 oligarchs, freeze all of their assets in the West. And then the most controversial point I have is that we should enforce a no-fly zone over Ukraine. It's just, it's not. People say that's going to be us going to war with Russia, but no, we signed a treaty with Ukraine back in 1994. It was called the Budapest Memorandum, where they gave up their nuclear weapons in exchange for our assistance in defending their territorial integrity. Their territorial integrity has been breached, and we have an obligation and a self-preservation obligation to do something right now. And if we can give the Ukrainians time to fight off the Russians, if we can, so that they're not being destroyed on a daily basis with a barrage of bombs, they might actually put Putin at bay, keep him at bay, so we don't have to face this ugly scenario afterwards.
One of the things that's really troubling to me is what you said is absolutely true, absolutely correct. And all of the people that I've spoken to from the intelligence, security, and geopolitical world say the same thing, but nobody seems to have the stomach to do this. So what's it going to take?
Well, I think it's really interesting because nobody had the stomach to sanction oligarchs 10 days ago, and now there's like a G7 coalition to hunt down oligarchs wherever they are and seize all their properties. So what it's going to take is more atrocities and more scary behavior from Vladimir Putin, so everybody wakes up to the fact that this is not just Ukraine's war. This is everybody's war with Putin. And it's, you can define it as you want. And everyone says we don't want World War III. And of course we don't, but we also don't want him to put us in a position where we have to end up, going face to face in a full-on major confrontation with Russia.
It's 5 o'clock in the morning here in Washington and afternoon there in London. I'm assuming you're in London or in Europe at this point.
Yep.
And another day is almost done, or will be done a lot sooner there than it is here. And people will have some things here to think about based on what's done there, because, we're just getting up, obviously, clearly. But what's the first thing that ought to be on the desk of President Biden, that ought to be on the desk of every single senator here in the U.S., and anybody that has any leverage in the intelligence and Pentagon communities now when it comes to dealing with this problem in Ukraine? What's the first thing that all of them need to talk about and get their heads together on?
Well, I think that we have to have a very clear and open debate about protecting Ukrainian airspace now. It's something that I would have never said myself, a week or 10 days ago. But we can't let Vladimir Putin win in Ukraine. We can't, because if he does, he'll be on our doorstep soon enough.